Out responding to our trials. Let me get there myself. James chapter 1, responding to our trials. And as I've said many times in this study already, if you're a Christian, you were probably either in a trial, have recently been through a trial, or about to enter a trial. Because God has plans for you, that is to make you like Christ. And He accomplishes that through trials. And so if we know that a great deal of our life is going to be spent characterized by being tried and tested, best to learn how to deal with them. And James tells us that in chapter 1. Really, the entire chapter is about this. If we were studying James, I'd show you how it's all connected. But when I started this study, remember I told you this is something kind of on my heart, and I didn't know where it was going to go. We will probably finish verse 4, maybe today and next week. Jump back to something I'd like to point out in verse 2, and then that may be it for this. We'll see. But right now, that's what I'm thinking. The first thing James told us is, in order to properly deal with your trials, you should first and foremost consider them a source of joy. Verse 2. Chapter 1, verse 2. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. So the first thing that James wants us to know is our trials should be considered a source of joy. And you might ask yourself, how am I supposed to do that? Trials are by nature terrible. That's why they're called trials. They're hard, they're frightening. They may be very serious sometimes, at times more so than others, have very serious consequences. They may cost me relationships. They may cost me money. They may cost me the future. How in the world can James expect me to have joy? To consider what I'm going through, what I'm experiencing, to be a source of joy in my life. Fortunately for us, that's what he explains in verses 3 and 4. And I started to touch on that last week by telling you this. If your trials are going to be a source of joy in your life, you can only view your trials through the perspective of the truth. Through the perspective of the truth. Most of us tend to view our trials from the perspective of our trial, what we're going through and how it affects us. And that's why we do so poorly when we encounter these trials. But that's not the lens through which we should view our trials. If they're going to become a source of joy for you, you're going to have to consider them only from the perspective of truth. And James told us what that truth is last week. He says, beginning in verse 3, know this. What's really happening to you is that the testing of your faith is producing endurance. That's the truth about your trial. It's not about what you're going through or what the circumstances are. For one person, a trial could be something very different than the same thing for another person. And so James tells us, know this. Here's the truth about your trial. That what is really happening here is not about a disease or a lost job, a failed marriage, right? I could go on and on, whatever your trial may be. That's not what's really happening. What's really happening here that you can't forget is this was sent in order to prove the character of your faith and to cause you to respond in one specific way. And that's what he tells us in verse 3. This thing has come upon you in order to test the character of your faith and to cause you to respond one specific way. One specific way. And so the first way you're going to be able to consider your trial a source of joy is if you consider it from the perspective of truth. The second thing that you're going to have to do in order for your trial to be a source of joy is what he tells us in verse 4. You're going to have to consider its outcome. You're going to have to consider its outcome. And that's what we're going to begin looking at today in verse 4. When you are in the midst of a trial, you can never forget what the outcome of all this is supposed to be. And that's what he tells us in verse 4. Look at what he says. Let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. That is the design of the trial. That's the outcome that God desires of your trial. If you are responding rightly to your trial with perseverance, which is what he said last week. Remember what we looked at last week in verse 3 is basically said this. When a trial comes into your life, its goal is to sort of act as a litmus test for your faith, and your response should be the desire to endure, to stay the course. So if you are responding rightly to your trial with perseverance, if a trial comes into your life and it results in this settled determination to trust God and honor God and glorify God and draw near to God, if a trial comes in your life and it intensifies your resolve to stay the course, to not give up, to lean on God even harder, to double down on your walk instead of distrusting God, doubting God, getting angry at God, or abandoning God. In other words, if your trial has resulted in a greater closeness to God, in a greater commitment to God, in a greater love for God, congratulations. You are handling your trial properly. And that's what he said last week in verse 3. You need to know that the design of this trial is it should cause you to respond with endurance. Endurance. And if you have done that, that is the right response to your trial. And if you continue to respond in that way, a second thing is going to happen, and that's what he says in verse 4. If the trial comes, and your decision is to respond to it by drawing closer to God, nearer to God, and walking, more closely to God, you've chosen to respond with endurance. If you do that, something else is going to happen according to verse 4. Let endurance have its perfecting work, James says. And this is a second reason you can consider your trial to be a source of joy. What's going to happen if you face your trial with endurance and you continue to respond with endurance, something else is going to happen to you. Maturity is going to come. By that I mean spiritual maturity. Remember, I told you that God has designs for each of us that go far beyond our sort of own selfish plans for ourselves. And that design is to grow you up spiritually. So that the longer you walk with Christ, the more you're like Christ until the day He appears and He transforms this lowly body to be completely conformed to His image. The theological term for this is sanctification, but James here calls it maturity. And what he tells us in verse 4 is, if you continue to respond to your trial correctly by enduring it, what's going to happen as a result is spiritual maturity. The trial will result in more Christ-likeness. And that's the main purpose for which it was sent. The trial comes, I decide, you know what? I trust God, and I'm just going to walk through this. I'm going to lean on Him. And if you continue to respond that way, one of the things that's going to happen is you're going to grow up spiritually. You're going to grow up. And the interesting thing about this is Paul tells us in Romans 5 and Peter tells us in 1 Peter, as a Christian, this is the only way you're going to grow up. Because this is the way God does it. He matures us as Christians through the way we respond to our trials. And that's part one of what I want to say in verse 4. Look at what he says. Let endurance, now I'm sort of paraphrasing it. I know you're reading probably several different versions of the Bible out there, so I'm going to sort of paraphrase it. Because the language here in this particular little few verses is not as perfect as it could be. And so here's what he says in the first part of verse 4. Let endurance finish its work. First part of verse 4, that's what he says. Let endurance finish its work. Let it finish. Let it finish. Here's the point that I want to make. Trials do not mature you. Okay? Trials do not mature you. Enduring them is what matures you. It isn't the trial that does it. This is an important distinction to make, because it takes us from the victim of a trial to becoming the victor over a trial. It isn't the trial that matures us. Okay? In other words, you may not have had any part in what came into your life, but you have everything to do with how it results, with how it ends up, with what the outcome is. Our typical take, and you hear this a lot, even in Christian songs and sermons and these other sorts of things, is God grows us through trials. No, not exactly. That's not what He does. What exactly happens is growth comes as a response to the trial, not as a result of the trial itself. The trial is just a tool. In the scheme of things, that the circumstances are meaningless themselves. You're going to grow as a Christian based on how you choose to endure what has come to you. It isn't the trial that does the growing, it's what you do with it that causes you to grow or not. And growth only comes if you continue to respond to the trial appropriately. And that's what James means when he says, let endurance, the endurance you chose in verse 3, let it finish. Don't stop it. Don't interrupt. His point is this: it's one thing to respond well when a trial comes, but it's a whole other thing to continue to respond well when it doesn't go away. And that's where maturity comes from. That's the part that does the work, the enduring the trial, the staying determined to trust God. It's easy when a trial comes in your life to respond by saying, I'm going to trust God, but you let it drag on. You let it get worse and worse and worse with no end in sight. It gets harder to stay determined, to trust God, to honor God, to glorify God, or to draw near to God. When the trial doesn't end or the trial goes from bad to worse, that's when we're tempted to change the way we respond to it. And James says, no, you can't do that. If endurance doesn't finish the work, you're not going to get anything out of this. You have to stay the course. Let endurance finish its work, James says. Don't stop it. Who here, I'm going to ask you a question, understands that the only thing that's harder for most of us than doing something is doing nothing? That's the only thing harder for us, most of us, than doing something, is to do nothing. And see, that's how most of us try and deal with our trials. A trial comes into our life, and here's what we do. We attack them some way or another, right? We start doing something to try to bring them to an end. We start doing something to try to relieve our trials. We start doing something to try and handle them ourselves, and that's where we go wrong. James is telling us here the only thing you should do when faced with trials is the hardest thing you can imagine doing. Nothing. Just endure it, and keep enduring it for as long as you have to endure it until it produces what God sent it to produce. In fact, that word here, I don't know what version of the Bible you're reading. In this one, it keeps using the word perfect, 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 perfect. That word should be translated endurance. It's the Greek word hupomone or hupomoneo sometimes. And it means to remain under something, to stay underneath something. That's what it means to endure something, to keep yourself underneath it. Keep yourself underneath it. It does no spiritual good when you're in a trial to start doing a bunch of stuff to try and end the trial, or to start doing a bunch of stuff to try to bring relief to yourself. The reason it does no good is because, once again, what you're going through is not about the trial. Now, at the same time, it's also, James isn't telling us, well, just lay there like a good Christian and say, woe is me, look how holy I am, I'm just going to ride this thing out. He's not saying to do that either. Look at what he says in verse 4. Let endurance finish its work. Let. When we read the word let, we typically think of the word allow. We read this, we read James as saying, allow endurance to do. That's a passive attitude. We read it like James is saying, well, just sit there and don't do anything. But that's not what the word means in Greek. It means control. It means possess. What James is telling us by saying that is this. In the midst of your trial, here's the one thing you should do. You should control your response to it. Control your response to your trial. That's what let means. Control yourself so that endurance can finish doing what it's trying to do. Limit your response to enduring your trial. Does that make any sense? That's what you can do. If you want to do something about your trial, the only thing you can do to cause it to do what it's supposed to do is limit your response to letting it do what it needs to do. No matter what happens, you limit your response to enduring your trial. That's what you do. That's active. That's not passive. Control yourself. Control yourself. You will never be able to control your trial, but you know what you can control? Yourself. How you respond to it. And you can choose to respond as we have been instructed to respond, by considering it a source of joy. And the longer it goes on, the more you consider it a source of joy. And the worse it gets, the more you consider it a source of joy. Let me give you a good example. We're not going to turn and read the passages because we're out of time now, really. But I want to give you the passages, and I want to give you the best example of what James is telling us to do. In Luke chapter 9, in verse 51, and you can write that down. Okay? The Bible says something about Jesus that if you're not careful, you'll miss it. He was at the end of his time in Galilee, and he was getting ready to go to Jerusalem. And it would be then that he was crucified. And what it says about Jesus in that verse is it said he set his face toward Jerusalem. And that doesn't seem to match, right? That doesn't sound very important when you just read what it says. It just sounds like that means he decided to go to Jerusalem. But that's not what it says or what it means. He set his face toward Jerusalem. Some of the older translations it said he set his face like a piece of flint focused on Jerusalem. Now why would it mention that about Jesus? Because he knew where he was going and what would happen when he got there. In Luke chapter 9, the Bible tells us that Jesus decided that I'm going to go through with this. I'm going to Jerusalem and I'm going to let everything that's supposed to happen to me happen to me. I'm not going to stop it. I'm not going to question it. I'm not going to fight against it. I am determined. That's what it means, set his face. I am determined to go to Jerusalem and let God do whatever it is God wants to do. That's what James means when he says in verse 4, let endurance finish the work. You have to have the same attitude toward your trial that Jesus had toward his. I'm not going to fight it. I'm not going to stop it. I'm going to let God do what he's trying to do in it. And I'm determined to let God do whatever it is he's going to do, no matter what I have to do to keep from getting in the way. Do you know that Jesus decides that in Luke chapter 9? He wasn't crucified until Luke chapter 23. You know what that means? It took 14 chapters to go from the decision to endure to acting on the decision. 6 months is about how long it took. And in that 6 months, things in Jesus' life went from bad to worse. From the moment he made that decision, I'm determined to go to Jerusalem and endure this cross. 6 months, everything went completely downhill until the day they put him on the cross. And how did he respond? With prayer, humility, obedience, quiet dependence on God, ministering to others while suffering himself. In fact, one of the things that's most remarkable about Jesus, the Bible even says that people thought this was remarkable. The very night he was on trial, he wouldn't even respond to his accusers. I can't open my mouth. I can't mess this up. Pilate says, I stood there amazed that I'm asking these questions, trying to let him go free, and he won't intervene. He's just taking it. That's how you do it. That's what James is telling us to do. You choose to endure and you let it finish. If it doesn't finish, you don't grow. If you stop it, you don't grow. If you intervene and relieve it, and all of these things we try to do, nothing's going to come of it. And what's going to have to happen is you're going to have to do something else later. To make up the ground, you just cost yourself. And so James says you can only consider your trial as a source of joy if you keep the end in mind. Because when you fail to continue to endure, it isn't going to produce what it was sent to produce. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2, one of my favorite verses, tells us what Jesus did. He limited his response to the cross to one response only. Here's what it says. He endured the cross. That's the same word James is using. Jesus handled the cross the way James is teaching us to handle our trials. It's something to be endured. And it's something that we have to determine to continue to endure and not mess up. At any given point, Jesus could have ruined everything by failing to just continue to endure what God was doing. There's another interesting thing. Boy, I hate we're out of time. There's a really cool verse near the, I don't remember where it is. You can find it. Where Jesus is the night before he's arrested, telling him what's going to happen to him. Peter steps up and he says, "We're never going to let this happen to you," all this kind of stuff. And Jesus tells him, "Get behind me, Satan. You don't want what God wants. I'm trying to go to the cross here. Don't stop me. This is hard enough as it is." That's endurance. That's what James is talking about. Your trial will never be. And I love to, I hate to interrupt myself with my own thought, but listen, Hebrews 12:2 says, "For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross." That's the same language James is using. You're never going to be able to consider your own cross a source of joy if you don't determine to just endure it and let it do the work. That's where we mess up. And Jesus' continued endurance saw him through the cross and beyond. And it accomplished what God designed to do in it. Jesus committed himself in his trial to one reaction: endure the process and continue to endure the process until the cross finishes its work. You see, patiently, faithfully, humbly, quietly enduring your trial is doing something about it. It is doing something about it. It's not just sitting back letting it happen to you. It takes a lot of work and a lot of determination to let your trial happen. And that's the only thing that you can do about it that's going to produce what God intends for it to produce. Let endurance finish the work. Don't try and stop your trial. If you ever want to see it as a source of joy, get out of the way. Stop considering your trial from the perspective of the circumstances it's brought you. Know what it's trying to produce in you and keep your eye on the result. That's what Jesus did in Hebrews 12:2. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. He kept his eye off the cross and kept it on what would come if he were able to go through with it. And that's what enabled him to go through with it. This is exactly what James is telling us to do. So, we're done. Quick question. If what you're telling me to do then is to just choose to continue to endure my trial till it produces what it's supposed to produce, what is it supposed to produce? What am I going for? That's the second part of James verse 4, and we'll tackle that next week. Let's have a word of prayer.